including ministers, to be seized. But thankfully, I had nothing at the time, and if it wasn't for ECOWAS, I might still be broke. But having said that, and I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I would like to say one thing, and that is, as far as I know, under the former government, officials, including ministers, were not at liberty to pilfer. If even a small amount was missing, then you would be prosecuted. And we have seen several cases of former government officials, former ministers, that have been charged with economic crimes, mostly on frivolous charges. But the former president, with the wealth that he had amassed, there was no accountability for him. And even the poll commission, one would have thought that if you are preaching transparency, accountability, probity, you would start with yourself. But if you exempt yourself from a commission of inquiry, when your mantra, or the mantra of the government, and myself included, is probity, transparency, and accountability, and you exclude yourself, then obviously some questions need to be asked. So in that regard, I do know that most of my colleagues that I have served with have dealt with their offices as best and diligently as possible. Maybe not out of concern for their pocket, but out of fear for the repercussions. But it is also clear that there was only one person that was exempt from this transparency and probity, and that was the former head of state.
Thank you.
Just, Mr. Chairman, a couple of questions. Mr. Singhateh, could you confirm who became a signatory after Ibu Jallow left to that account?
I cannot confirm who became a signatory. I thought that the funds were being dispersed through the Ministry of Finance. This is what I believed.
Surely you were aware at some stage that Baba Job was signing on an account at Central Bank?
At no point in time was I aware that Baba Job was an assistant secretary at the office of the president during the transition and immediately after. I cannot see how an assistant secretary in government would be a signatory to a central bank account.
Mr. Singhateh, it was public knowledge that Baba Job was in charge of substantial amount of resources during a period when you were still in the government. What did you make of it?
Well, Baba Job used to deal directly with President Jammeh. None of us were privy to these transactions. But what I do know is that there were some monies that were dispersed from Libya. I don't know exactly how much and in what frequency, but the one that I do recall, and bear with me, I have not seen any documentation to that effect. I was only privileged to have spoken with the Libyan ambassador at the time, who complained that they had dispersed $5 million United States to the Gambia government through Baba Job for the purchase of groundnuts. There was an appeal made to Libya to assist with funding the trade season. Farmers had grown their groundnuts and the trade season was upon us, and Gambia government could not afford the money to buy the groundnuts. And so the Libyan government at the time was approached. And from what I understand, from the complaints of the Libyan ambassador and basically from the fact that there were no funds to buy the groundnuts, was that this $5 million was not actually used for the actual purpose for which it was meant for. Now, I don't believe that at the time that we were in the transition period that Baba Jobe had anything to do with the account at Central Bank. I don't want to believe that. Because as far as we are concerned, those monies were dispersed for the hospitals, for the schools, for the airport, and for other projects. And what I do know is that the last project was either the Carnifin Hospital or the Briam Hospital, where there was an argument in cabinet as to who to give this project to. And we were made to understand that those were the final funds in the account after which it should be closed.
This was when? What year?
This was must have been in 1996, because we were coming to the end of the transition period.
Mr. Singhateh, just in relation to Baba Jobe, I'm
Yes.
sure you are now aware that the account was not closed, and it was in fact overdrawn after the $32,220,000. It was overdrawn to the amount of $28,500,000, which then had to be converted to a loan in addition to the $35 million. It is a matter of public record that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank engaged with the government during the period when you were there regarding the non-accounting of these funds that were being taken from the central bank without due process. Can you tell us about this? What happened? You were there.
Yes, I was there, but
Yes.
I was not aware that the account had been overdrawn at all. And that should never have happened.
What were you aware of? We were under sanction by IMF. They in fact made the government refund some of the assistance that had been given. You were in cabinet. So what did you understand to have happened to have led to that situation, if you are now telling us that you were not aware?
No, I was not aware of the fact that the account was overdrawn. We were aware that we did have some issues with the International Monetary Fund, but there was no cabinet paper explaining the reason why. And as far as I know, the then Minister of Finance was addressing these problems with the IMF, and we were given all assurance that they would address whatever problems there were, and we would be back on track and normalize our relations with them.
There's just something I don't understand, and maybe like you to explain. You and the ex-president and a few colleagues of yours took over this country. 22 years down the line, some of you are telling us you were not aware of what the ex-president was doing from 1995. Don't you think you owe the Gambian people more than just telling us that you were not aware? Did you abdicate your responsibilities to the ex-president? How come you were not aware of what he was doing?
Well, we were not aware of everything that he was doing, and it is not physically possible for you to be aware of everything that a person does. But the 28 million that you are talking about did not come during the transition period, as I am made to understand. That came after.
Yes, it did.
And
yes.
if it came after...
Do you consider your responsibility only to have been during the transition?
No, but what I am trying to distinguish,
yes.
the period under the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council, which ended in 1996, or as soon as the president-elect was sworn in, that is the former president, and then a new cabinet was formed.
Yes.
Now, The period under which the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council was in office, we would not allow the president to do anything that was inimical to the interest of our country, providing that we knew. What we don't know, you don't know. If he had been doing certain things that are only coming out today, if we had known at the time, he would have been stopped. But let me just cite a couple of examples. It's not that the president was allowed to do everything with impunity. There have been instances where we have stood up to him. One example that I would like to give, with your permission, is when he decided to sell Gamcell. Gamcell was set up by the parent company Gamtel. And I was the minister at the time. But when I traveled, I returned and found that it had been sold. And I kicked against it, and the sale was reversed. In addition to that, there have been other instances where ministers have stood up. But the problem is that once that happens, especially after 1997 upwards, either your responsibilities are revoked, or you cannot get access to the president, you cannot call the president. Another example that I will give you, I was given an instruction to release 5 Chinese vessels that were caught poaching in our waters. And I insisted that unless they pay the minimum fine as prescribed by law, I will not release them. Now, that led to the portfolios of fisheries, natural resources, and the environment being taken away from me for a whole year. And during that period, I could not speak to him on the phone, and I could not see him in audience. The only time I would see the president would be in cabinet, or at July 22nd, or Independence Day. Now, in addition to that, when I was Minister for Trade, and we did have a problem with the dalasi spiraling out of control and price of commodities rising, he was sending some of his security personnel to impound foreign exchange belonging to some of these dealers, and I advised against it. So from 2003 up to the time I left office, I did not have any audience with him, and I had not spoken to him on the phone till date. So I just want to paint a picture that even though you try to stand up and advocate for certain things to be done, it is very easy for you to be shut out and ignored completely. Another example that I would like to give. Okay, if you don't have time, I just want to paint a picture so that you understand that there was no abdication of responsibility. But the powers in the Constitution that need revisiting gave him so much individual power that he could just do anything that he wanted without being challenged. And that is what happened until he left.
Just one last question. During the period that the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council was in charge, before we transitioned, so to speak, to constitutional rule, you said, I think you asked a rhetorical question, why would you ask him to file an account? In hindsight, don't you think that you and your colleagues and the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council actually actively enabled the lack of transparency that the ex-president then continued to manifest throughout the period he was in power?
I would agree with you if we were aware of the lack of transparency at the time.
No, Mike, you did not expect him to account. That is
well, the thing is that somebody
indicated.
who will talk to you about transparency and probity every time you meet and accountability, you would trust, and we trusted him.